The wartime alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union has now completely broken down. The world is now divided into two hostile camps with two very different ideologies. Western democracy is standing eyeball to eyeball against the Soviet Union and their belief in dictatorship and communism. The border between these two opposing camps runs right through the center of the continent of Europe. This border, barbed wire and protected by soldiers and tanks, is known as the Iron Curtain. Both sides have not gone to war with each other. Fear of nuclear weapons, one side launching their weapons against the other, mutually assured destruction, has prevented conflict between the two sides, but they both regularly exchange harsh words and often fight each other through what we call proxy wars, where they use other countries to fight each other in order to wage their own war. This is why the period is known as the Cold War, because it didn't go hot. There was no direct fighting between the Soviet Union and the United States and their allies. In the meantime, both sides continue to suspect the intention of the other and continue to build up their stockpiles of nuclear weapons. Certain parts of the world are where the Cold War tensions are at their greatest. In this briefing, I want to bring you up to speed on what these potential flashpoints could be. This is the world divided by the Cold War and the two camps that the world is split into. The Western world, the democracies, in purple, in North America, Canada, and the United States. Western Europe is all allied with the United States. These are the democracies that together have formed the organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, designed to protect each other against the common threat that they perceive from the Soviet Union. The other camp is colored here in red. The Soviet Union, her allies in China. The inset map here shows Central Europe and the divide that runs down the center of Europe. Winston Churchill calls this the Iron Curtain. To the west, we have the democracies of Western Europe, and to the east, we have Eastern Europe, the communist countries dominated by the Soviet Union. The potential flashpoints for any confrontation between the two sides are as follows. Anywhere along this border running through the center of Europe. The city of Berlin, the Korean Peninsula in the Far East, and finally Cuba in the Caribbean. The Berlin Crisis. Since the end of World War II, Germany has been divided into two parts. West Germany is democratic and occupied by the British, the French, and the Americans. East Germany is communist and occupied by the Soviet Union. The city of Berlin, however, lies 150 miles inside East Germany. And just like Germany itself, the city is divided into several parts, east and west. West Berlin is occupied by soldiers from the United States, from Britain and France, whereas East Berlin is occupied by soldiers from the Soviet Union. Whenever there is a crisis, whenever there is tension between the East and the West, Berlin is often likely to be the flashpoint. Isolated from West Germany, Berlin is an easy location with which to threaten the Western Allies, as any soldiers in West Berlin can only be supplied by air. In 1948, in an attempt to seize West Berlin, Joseph Stalin cut off West Berlin from the rest of West Germany. In doing this, by locking and shutting the road routes through East Germany to West Berlin and preventing ships reaching West Berlin by canals, he forced the Western Allies to supply Berlin by air, which they successfully did. West Berlin is also a potential threat to Eastern Europe because people move from East Berlin into West Berlin and from West Berlin can fly out to West Germany. By 1960, so many people were leaving Eastern Europe via East Berlin into West Berlin that Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, actually builds a wall between the two Berlins, between the East and the West, known as the Berlin Wall. This further isolates West Germany and West Berlin. The Berlin Wall has become a symbol of the Cold War. Famously, in 1961, President Kennedy of the United States flew into West Berlin and declared that West Berlin was a symbol of the success of democracy. West Berlin has been rebuilt from the ashes of World War II, whilst East Berlin is still a poor ruin of a city compared to the West. Kennedy used this as an example to say how successful the Western democratic system is, and famously declared that Berlin is a symbol of freedom to the rest of the world, and that everyone who believes in democracy is a Berliner themselves. His famous quote from his speech was, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner. Here is the map to illustrate the potential situation that Berlin finds itself in. West Germany over here, occupied by the democracies since the end of the war. East Germany over here, occupied by the Soviets. Berlin itself, way inside the East German borders. The city itself, again, split into these zones of occupation. This is West Berlin and can only be supplied by air if the Soviets close the land route from the west. Berlin is a very, very easy way to threaten the West. Any clash between East and West puts pressure on Berlin. The next crisis between the two sides is the Korean Peninsula. Just like Germany at the end of World War II, Korea was occupied by the Soviet Union in the north and the Americans in the south. The north became a dictatorship under the communists, while the south, South Korea, was occupied by the Americans and became a democracy. In 1950, the leaders of the north, with Stalin's consent and approval, launched an attack to unite the Korean Peninsula. The United States and the United Kingdom sent troops to fight the communist north. In doing so, they pushed the North Koreans all the way back to the Chinese border before the Chinese intervened and pushed the British and Americans all the way back. Finally, in 1953, a ceasefire was agreed between the two countries. However, technically, both these nations remain at war, and the border between the two Koreas is fraught with danger and rarely peaceful. In 1956, the next flashpoint is the Suez Crisis. In 1956, convinced that Egypt was about to turn communist, the British and the French invaded Egypt to retake the vital Suez Canal. The canal had been built by the French, but had been owned by the British. In 1956, the Egyptians took over the canal. They nationalized it and made it Egyptian property. In order to regain control of the canal, the British and the French agreed a policy with Israel to invade Egypt. While the Israelis invaded Egypt, the British and French would occupy the canal on a pretext to protect it from the warring Israelis and Egyptians. Unfortunately, the British and French did this without consulting with their American ally. In doing so, the Americans were outraged and threatened to bankrupt Britain if we didn't pull our forces out, whilst the Soviet Union threatened to use atomic weapons against Paris and London if the British and French did not withdraw from Egypt. The UK and France in 1956 withdrew. A map showing the location of the Suez Canal linking the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, in doing so cutting about 8,000 miles from the journey around Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean. In 1956, at the same time as the Suez Crisis, the Hungarians rose up against their occupiers, the Soviet Union. They appealed for help from Western Europe. They wanted to remove the communists and establish a democracy in Hungary. However, distracted by the Suez Crisis, no one in the West intervened to help the Hungarians on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and their uprising was brutally put down. Their attempt to topple Stalin failed. And whilst all of these flashpoints are going on, in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, a former French colony, was embroiled in a civil war. One side, the South, wanted closer links with the United States, whilst the other wanted closer links with the Soviet Union. This is an example of the Soviet Union and the Americans fighting a war by proxy, not getting directly involved, but arming two sides in a conflict to fight their war for them. Both the US and the Soviets supported their own side, but in 1959, America took one additional step by starting to commit her own combat troops to Vietnam. So Vietnam in Southeast Asia on the other side of the world. What makes the world a dangerous place is that the two opposing ideologies of democracy and dictatorship, of American democracy and Soviet communist dictatorship, they both see the world in a very simple way. Both sides only see winning and losing. Every country that they win is a loss for the other country, and every country they lose makes their enemies stronger. If one country is lost to the other, there is a belief called domino theory that it will lead to adjacent countries also falling to that ideology. The communists see democracy as an evil force that will spread, and the democracies see communism as a dangerous, expanding ideology that will do the same. Both sides believe that any sign of weakness, however small, will lead to other things happening. It meant never allowing the opposition to sense weakness and being prepared to play chicken with the enemy, going eyeball to eyeball, famously begging the question, who would blink first?